The First World War was unlike anything humanity had ever endured before. Men who marched in with hope quickly found themselves swallowed by mud, blood, and despair. In the trenches, life was not life at all, it was survival. The air stank of decay. The ground was thick with rats. Lice burrowed into every seam of clothing. Boots rotted on men's feet as trench foot gnawed away at flesh. And above all, the guns never stopped. Day after day, night after night, the thunder of artillery shook the earth and the human mind alike. War had always been brutal, but here it became something monstrous. Still, in this wasteland, stories began to spread. Strange, unsettling stories, tales of ghostly archers who appeared at Mons, loosing arrows to turn the tide. Whispers of a monstrous hound, said to be some German experiment let loose to stalk the night. And perhaps most haunting of all, the visions of fallen comrades appearing in dreams or shadows, warning their friends of danger. These were the myths that soldiers clung to, half out of fear, half out of hope. But there was one legend that stood apart, a legend darker than the rest, not of spirits, not of beasts, but of men. Men who had once been soldiers, who had worn the same uniforms as their brothers in arms. Yet somewhere in the endless chaos, they had shed their humanity. They hid by day, deep in ruined dugouts, and when the sun sank, they came out. They robbed, they killed, and some whispered they even ate. These were no longer comrades, nor enemies in uniform. They were something else entirely. The soldiers called them the wild men of no man's land. The stories described them as shadows of men, soldiers once, but soldiers no longer. They had stripped away their uniforms, their discipline, their very humanity, until nothing remained but instinct and hunger. These were the deserters, the forgotten, the broken, men who had fled the madness of the trenches, only to embrace a new kind of madness in the void between. They were said to burrow deep underground, carving shelters from collapsed dugouts and shattered cellars, waiting out the daylight in silence, and when darkness fell, they emerged. They did not march in formation. They did not carry banners or flags. They slithered through the mud like predators, moving from crater to crater beneath the pale glow of flares. Soldiers swore they heard them whispering in guttural tones, neither German nor French nor English, but something else, a feral language born of survival. By night, they prowled the edges of the trenches, scavenging supplies, looting corpses, and sometimes striking down the wounded who cried too loudly. The bravest men who ventured into no man's land alone were often the ones who never came back. And then there were the darker whispers. Some claimed that hunger had driven these wild men beyond all limits, that the wounded, dragged into holes and never seen again, had not simply died, but been consumed. The screams carried across the mud, high and terrible, before fading into silence. Whether truth or nightmare, the image spread through every army that heard it. These were no longer comrades, nor enemies, nor even men. They were something else entirely, the wild men of no man's land. The first written hints of the wild men came not in fiction, but in memory. In 1920, Arden Arthur Holm-Bean published The Squadron, a memoir of his service in the war. Within its pages, buried among tales of mud and steel, lies a chilling passage. Bean described how his unit had been ordered to search for escaped German prisoners of war. They combed through the shattered countryside, weapons ready, nerves taut, until they came upon a small copse, a lonely patch of trees rising from the desolation. There, the atmosphere shifted. Something was wrong. The men felt it before they even knew why. As they searched, they encountered members of a salvage company, troops tasked with gathering scrap metal and abandoned gear. But these hardened men carried warnings on their lips. They spoke of strange figures prowling the fields after sunset. Deserters, they said, who had turned wild. Soldiers who no longer obeyed any flag, who crept out only at night to hunt and to rob. Bean recorded how the salvage men refused to move through certain areas after dusk. It was too dangerous, they insisted. That very night, the warning seemed to echo across the landscape. Bean's men heard the sharp crack of gunfire in the distance. They froze, listening. Then came the cries, not the disciplined shouts of soldiers, but something more primitive, more terrible. Inhuman noises that tore across the still air before falling silent. To some it sounded like a raid gone wrong. To others, it was proof that in the shadows of no man's land, a new kind of predator was lurking. the wild men themselves. To understand the legend of the wild men, we must first understand desertion itself. Every army in the Great War faced it. The British recorded over 20,000 men sentenced for desertion, with hundreds executed by firing squad, made into examples so that others might stay in line. The French saw nearly 50,000 desert their ranks, many after the disastrous mutinies of 1917, when men refused to march once more into slaughter. The Germans suffered tens of thousands of desertions as the war dragged into exhaustion, hunger, and collapse. And in Russia, where revolution boiled beneath the surface, desertion became a flood, entire units melting away, some vanishing into the countryside, others taking up arms for the Bolsheviks. Even the Austro-Hungarian Empire, straining under its many nationalities, bled soldiers who no longer wished to die for a fading crown. The reasons were always the same, and yet always personal. Some men could no longer endure the filth and fear, their minds shattered by shell shock, what we now call PTSD. Others rebelled against incompetent leaders who sent them into hopeless charges. Some simply lost faith in the cause, realizing the promises of glory were nothing but lies buried in mud. Desertion was not only a crime, it was a survival instinct. And where did these deserters go? Some slipped back home, hiding among sympathetic families. Others lurked in nearby villages, hoping to blend with civilians. But the most chilling stories spoke of those who never left the front at all, men who vanished into the wastelands between the trenches, no man's land itself. If those whispers were true, it was from here that the legends of the wild men began to grow. The war did not end the stories. In the years that followed, they appeared again, this time on paper. In 1930, Walter Frederick Morris published Behind the Lines. Though written as fiction, the book carried an unsettling ring of truth. Morris described deserters who had abandoned their posts, crawling into forgotten dugouts and ruined tunnels. There, cut off from the world above, they survived like scavengers, stealing what they could, feeding on scraps, lurking like animals in the night. His pages painted a picture of men who had become feral, half-human shadows haunting the edges of the front. Readers wondered, was this just invention or a memory in disguise? Then, more than a decade later, another voice added fuel to the legend. Sir Osbert Sitwell, a veteran himself, wrote in his autobiography that groups of deserters had indeed lived underground, banded together in the wastelands. But his claim went further, far darker. Sitwell insisted that after the armistice these men were hunted down and gassed in their hiding places, exterminated like vermin to erase the shame they embodied. It was a chilling allegation, one that no official record confirms and which no other witness repeats. Yet Sitwell's words carried weight, if only because they came from someone who had been there. Together, Morris's haunting novel and Sitwell's disturbing testimony blurred the line between truth and legend. Were these glimpses of reality, twisted by time and memory, or were they fabrications, born from trauma and imagination? Either way, they kept the story of the wild men alive, giving shape to a fear that refused to die. Among all the whispers of the wild men, none were more terrifying than these. Soldiers told of comrades who stumbled into shell holes after nightfall, wounded and unable to climb free. At first, their cries for help rang out across the shattered ground, desperate, pleading, human. But then, according to the stories, shadows would gather. Figures moving low, almost crawling, drawn by weakness like predators to prey. The cries would rise high and panicked, then break into screams. And finally, silence. When dawn came, the holes were empty. No body, no trace, only blood in the mud, and the uneasy certainty that something unspeakable had happened there. What fueled the terror was not just the vanishing of men, but the whispers of what followed. Hunger, it was said, had driven the wild men beyond all bounds of human behavior. They scavenged not only food and supplies, but flesh. Cannibalism, that word alone, was enough to make even hardened veterans shudder. To imagine that a fellow soldier, once marching in step beside them, could descend into such horror was almost unbearable. Night in the trenches was already a torment, filled with the groans of the dying, the shriek of shells, the sudden rattle of machine guns. But for those who believed the stories, there was another sound to dread. The unearthly cries carried by the wind, not quite human, not quite animal, drifting across no man's land. Men swore they heard them, far off, between bursts of silence. To some, they were echoes of madness. To others, proof that something monstrous walked in the dark. For every dark legend, there are always voices of reason, attempts to explain what might really have happened. The tales of the wild men, chilling as they are, may not speak of feral deserters at all, but of ordinary horrors, misheard and misunderstood in the chaos of war. Some historians suggest that soldiers mistook trench raids for encounters with wild men. At night, both sides sent out raiding parties, small groups slipping into no man's land to steal supplies, cut wire, or capture prisoners. In the confusion, when silhouettes clashed in the dark, it was easy to imagine something more sinister. The grunts, the screams, the sudden bursts of violence. To a frightened sentry, they might sound less like trained soldiers and more like beasts. Others point to the cries of the wounded. No man's land was littered with men who had fallen between the lines, some surviving for hours, even days. Their voices carried strangely over the mud, sometimes garbled, sometimes broken by pain, sometimes seeming inhuman in the stillness of night. To those listening, half asleep in their trenches, such cries could take on a monstrous quality. And then there is the fog of war itself. In a world of constant fear, exhaustion, and half-whispered rumour, truth bends. One man hears a story, another repeats it, a third swears he's seen it himself. Soon, the line between memory and myth disappears. What began as a scream in the dark or a skirmish between raiders grew into something larger, something legendary, and in that soil of fear and imagination, the wild men took root. When we step back from the shadows of rumour, most historians reach a sobering conclusion. The wild men of no man's land, as terrifying as the stories may sound, were almost certainly myth. No reliable record confirms their existence. No official reports, no verifiable testimonies, no evidence beyond scattered memoirs, novels, and whispers carried down the years. To the trained eye of history, they are echoes of fear rather than facts. Scholars point out that these tales appear most often among British, French, German, and Commonwealth soldiers, men who endured the long, grinding stalemate of trench warfare. American troops, who entered the conflict later and faced a different phase of the fighting, never seem to mention such creatures. That absence is telling. Yet, even if the wild men never truly prowled the mud between the lines, their legend carries meaning. War does not only wound the body, it scars the mind. Under the endless thunder of shells, amid the cries of the dying, men grasped for ways to explain the unexplainable. Strange sounds became predators. Missing comrades became victims of unseen hunters. Fear itself became a story, passed from mouth to mouth until it hardened into legend. So while historians dismiss the wild men as rumour, they still matter. They reveal how soldiers tried to process the chaos and horror around them. In that way, the wild men were real, not as flesh and blood, but as mirrors of the human mind under siege. In the end, whether the wild men of no man's land truly existed, or whether they were nothing more than whispers born of fear, may not even matter. What matters is what the stories reveal. War, at its core, is not only about territory or strategy or armies clashing in the mud. It is about men, ordinary men, broken down to their rawest state. In the trenches, humanity itself was stripped away layer by layer. The mud, the rats, the endless guns. They wore down the body, the screams, the nightmares, the waiting for death. They wore down the mind. And in that space, legends took root. Legends that gave voice to what soldiers could not explain or could not bear to face. The wild men embodied a terrible possibility, that in war, a man might lose more than his life. He might lose himself. He might surrender his soul to hunger, to madness, to fear, until nothing remained but a shadow, scavenging in the dark. And that thought, more than any enemy across the field, was what truly haunted the trenches. So when we hear these stories today, the cries in the night, the missing bodies, the whispers of cannibalism, we should hear more than a myth. We should hear the echo of trauma, the desperate attempt of human minds to wrestle with the unthinkable. The wild men may never have walked the earth as flesh and blood, but as a reflection of war's power to strip away humanity, they were, and remain, horrifyingly real.